Let's go.
Let's go. Oh,
Do you want to?
sorry. I'll let you.
Next one.
I'm excited and I feel relaxed and I'm ready to party. Let's say sorry. You don't need to do that. You don't need to apologize. It's a fucked up female habit. You don't need to be sorry for anything ever.
Can you guess what every woman's worst nightmare is?
I don't have rage issues.
I have nothing to prove to you.
When I'm good, I'm very good. But when I'm bad, I'm better.
I say when it comes to stardom and Lauren, there are no accidents.
Hi, Karen Peterson.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Citizen Dame, the podcast where we live in the future. I'm your host, Lauren Humphreys Brooks, and with me, as always, is Karen Peterson. Hello, Karen.
The future really is now.
The future is now. It is.
Hello. How are you?
I'm pretty good. It is a lovely day here in New York City. I think the last time we recorded, it's like it is hotter than hell. It is hotter than the whatever the second circle, because hell actually gets colder the deeper you go. Like it's really cold in the center. Not many people realize that. I think it's according to Dante or something.
Yeah, they gotta read more.
Yeah, exactly. But the outer circle is really fucking hot, and there's like the lake of fire and all that stuff. Anyways, yeah, it was the lake of fire a little while ago, and now it's not, which is really nice. So
well, that's good.
How about you, Karen? How are you?
You know, it's a very lovely morning here as well. It's 70 degrees, and which is, you know, not what it's been the last couple of weeks. So we'll see how long it lasts, but yeah, it's great. And
Yeah.
Today is officially the last day of my vacation. I have to go back to work tomorrow. I'm a little bit sad, but also I love my job, so it's fine. But yeah, today's the day that I got to finish all the things that I didn't get done over the last 2 weeks.
Whenever you go on vacation, so I was just like, so I'll do all of this stuff. And then it's just like, oh, I have one day left. I should probably do all that stuff.
Yeah. I made a list, like my vacation to-dos, because I was doing basically a staycation, but I had some things that were planned, like I had some friends from out of town and we went to Disneyland for 3 days, which was so much fun. I've lived within an hour of Disneyland, other than when I lived out of state. I've lived within an hour of Disneyland for pretty much most of my life. And I've never gone there 3 days in a row. So it was fun, but it was also like, oh, by day 3, it was like, can we just sit on the curb and people watch? Like, this is nice. And so, but it's been really fun. But yeah, I didn't get done a lot of things that I was so sure I was going to do.
Must be nice to just like, I'm just going to go to Disneyland.
Yeah, it is.
I was looking at some of your pictures actually, and I was just like, what, you know, the concept of having that kind of a theme park that close just doesn't register with me. And I mean, in the United States, I've lived in New York. I've never lived that close to a theme park, so the whole concept is just very foreign to me.
I used to live walking distance actually, and there were a few times that, because at that point I had an annual pass, and my friends, I had, you know, roommates and stuff, we would just go all the time. And you have to be into it. Like for me, I love, you know, aside from the predatory capitalism of it all, I love, there's just something for me that's really magical about Disneyland, and so I love it. So I can just sit on a bench on Main Street and just watch people go by and just watch kids just so, you know, just their giant eyes, just so excited about things. And, you know, I really do love that, and I never get tired of it. But it also isn't for everybody, and I recognize that. You know, I have friends that are like, I don't ever want to set foot in that place. Like, okay, you know what? I respect that, and don't come. If you don't want to go, don't go, because you'll spoil it for other people. So, but yeah, no, it was great. It was my friends and their 2 girls, and we just, you know, just got to do all the things. Everyone had a good time. Nobody fought. You know, the weather, it got hot, but it was never. It was luckily it was so much cooler than a couple weeks ago, so it was the perfect time to go. And yeah, it's just nice.
Cool. That sounds great.
How have things been for you? I know your vacation's over and you're back to work.
Yes, I am back to work, unfortunately, but it's been fine. Like I'm just getting back into the groove of things, and I managed to do what I often do, which is schedule myself stupidly. But it's okay. Everything's okay.
Your boss is a real hard ass
I
sometimes.
know. My boss really overscheduled me this month, and I was just like, who the fuck did this schedule? Who did this? I think they should be fired. It's really terrible. So yeah, but it's been kind of a weird week, sort of a bunch of weird different things. I got a new tattoo, which was fun. I like getting tattoos. Otherwise I would not have them. But it means that
It looks so good too.
thank you. It means that the week was kind of odd in a certain sense, because for anyone who's ever gotten a tattoo, I think my experience of them is that there's always like this, you get really excited and then you get the tattoo and it's just like, oh, I'm exhausted now. So yeah, it's an interesting experience.
Yeah. Fun.
So today we're going to have a conversation about I don't know how to put this. I called it Days of Future Past.
Yeah.
And essentially what we wanted to talk about was, because we talked about AI last week, and we talked about like different representations of AI in cinema. And now we kind of want to talk about the representations of the future in cinema. We thought it would be interesting. Karen suggested this. Thought it would be interesting to discuss films that are that take place in the future for the year of the film, but are actually now in our past. So the three, yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say the other phrase I had thought of was the tomorrow of yesterday.
Just reminds me of a Bob's Burgers episode, just like tomorrow is yesterday. Tomorrow is today's yesterday or something. No, today is tomorrow's yesterday. There we go.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's the idea behind this. So the three films that we're going to talk about are 2001: A Space Odyssey, Soylent Green, and Back to the Future Part 2. And I kind of wanted to go in chronological order based on the year that the film is set. So we want to start with 2001, which actually goes to the very, very deep past for at least part of the film, and then fast forwards to a very distant future for 1968, but fast forwards to 2001. And I think that this is probably, of the three films that we're talking, actually all three of these films are iconic in their own ways, but this is probably the most iconic. It's one of those films that everyone has seen. Whether or not you enjoyed it or whether or not you paid attention to it is an open question, because it's such an iconic film, but it isn't an easy film in any sense. I don't think it is quite as difficult as some people make it out to be, but I think that one of the issues that you run into when watching this film is that there isn't a solid plot. Like, the most plotted element of the entire film is the central section of the HAL 9000 kind of adventure, right? And that's where there's the most dialogue, there's the most like actual, this creation of tension and like the most kind of traditional narrative throughout the entire film. But it's, in some ways it's a very straightforward film, and in some ways it's an incredibly complicated one. And so talking about it is kind of weird, because it's like, okay, so what happens in 2001: A Space Odyssey? Well, human beings evolve from sort of ape-like creatures, basically, at least that's the way that they're represented. And there's a monolith, and then there's a computer AI that becomes murderous, and then we become star children, apparently. So that's kind of the plot of 2001, but of course that's ridiculously simplified. So Karen, you said that when you watched this film again, that like you've been waiting for this film to kind of click with you, and that it finally did. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I've seen this a bunch of times. I honestly don't even know how many times I've watched it. A couple of years ago, they actually did an IMAX release of it. And so, it was like a 70 millimeter IMAX thing. I was like, I have to go check that out. It really is an iconic film for a lot of reasons, mostly for the visuals. And every time I've watched it, I've thought, I know that this is, I mean, it's in the top 10 for Sight and Sound, their most recent poll of critics. It frequently comes up. It's like one of the highest rated, I guess, movies, sci-fi movies of all time, still to this day. It's very it's been borrowed from heavily. It's been what's the word I'm looking for, parodied. It's like this is a movie that is frequently referenced and homaged. And every time I've watched it, I've just been like, I recognize that it looks very good and that there's a lot to it, but it just never really clicked for me. But it was also one that I wasn't going to give up on, because I always knew that at some point I would watch it and that would be the time I'd finally be like, okay, now I get this movie. Now I feel this movie and I understand why everyone loves it so much. And that actually happened for me last night, which it's so interesting that it was like this viewing. But yeah, I was sitting at home and turned it on. It's currently streaming on Max. And I turned it on, and I think one of the things that helped is I read a couple of like one essay and then a couple of just short blurbs of people's thoughts about it and why, just like really quick thoughts about why they liked it. And so I went into the movie kind of with other people's perspectives. And so I was watching it, and it was all the same things that I've seen, multiple times before, but I just was really I was a lot more engaged in it. It didn't feel like this homework assignment, I guess. It felt like I was just sitting down ready to immerse myself in this very Kubrick world. And I let it just kind of wash over me. And this was the time. Like, I really enjoyed it. I thought, man, this really is a fantastic film. It says so much about humanity and about, I'm trying to, like, this is still fresh for me, so I'm like trying to figure out the right way to word it, but it just it really felt like now this film has now resonated with me, and now I can really appreciate what it is other people have appreciated for 50 years, 50 plus years.
Well, it's such, like I said, it's such an odd film in a lot of ways, because it isn't very plot driven.
Right.
It's very visual, and people have talked about the like you said, the visual aspects of it and how deeply influential it is. In terms, I think that we'll talk about that in a minute, about the aesthetics of 2001 being really probably one of the most influential sci-fi films ever. And yet you've got this like somewhat difficult thing to kind of parse out. I've heard people talk about, it's interesting that this was the viewing that kind of convinced you, because I've heard people talk about, well, this is a film that you have to see on the big screen. And I could kind of see the argument there, given that it's so slow in many ways, and it's so dependent on that building up of the visuals and the kind of willingness to immerse yourself in what Kubrick is showing you. And a lot of it is what is being shown, but also being heard as well. There's a lot of not just the music, but the ambient sound, the choices that he makes about where there's sound and where there isn't sound. And so much of that I can definitely imagine would be a major factor in terms of seeing it like on the big screen. That wasn't your experience.
No. Yeah. I don't know. It's really weird. I honestly, I think it was, and this is an argument. This has been something that has been back in the conversation the last couple of days. I really think this is a perfect case for why we need film criticism, not just influencers, but film criticism. Because I really think that reading stuff from intelligent people who had a point of view and who really broke this down, I think that helped me. It's not that I didn't understand the movie, I did, but it helped me really have a deeper appreciation for what it was. And yeah, like, to me, this is a perfect argument for why we need film criticism still in the world.
Yeah, because you kind of come to I remember seeing this film for the first time when I was a teenager, and being like, I don't understand. Like,
Oh yeah.
I liked it in the sense that I liked the visuals, I liked the HAL 9000 plot. I understood at some level why this was so influential, but I was just like, I don't know what I'm supposed to take away from it, right? And then I've seen it multiple times as I've gotten older. I didn't watch all of it last night, but I watched a good bit of it last night. And yeah, I think that as you kind of have seen it more times, and then as you watch it more times, and probably as you get older, you begin to realize like, oh, okay, I think I get what is being said here, right, at some level.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the element of, especially the element of the future here, right? So you've got these like three sections really of the film. You've got the Dawn of Man, the HAL 9000 plot, and then Jupiter and Beyond Infinity, right? And the Jupiter Beyond Infinity section is, I think, probably that's the one that confounds people the most.
Oh, yeah.
The most plot-driven section of the film is very much the HAL 9000, but they're all connected by the appearance of this monolith, which shows up initially in the Dawn of Man sequence and is kind of the beginning of human evolution, right? It's when humans begin to become human. And is especially associated, interestingly enough, with violence. And then it shows up again on the moon. And it's interesting, this film being made in 1968. So in 2001, according to Kubrick, we not only have been to the moon, but we have like colonies and space stations and people traveling across the galaxy, just like however they sort of feel like.
That's something I find fun about this movie, is the fact that like, so this came out the year before the moon landing, and then so now he's jumping forward like 30 years in time basically, and it's like, yeah, that they would imagine that all of this could happen in 30 years, and yet when you look at, you know, a movie like Soylent Green, which we're going to talk about next, that how that's like 50 years in the future, you know, it's just really interesting how people imagine the world would change so much in that time, and we look back and we're like, well, it's definitely different technology wise, but the world doesn't look as different as they used to imagine that it would, you know.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting, and I think that, and we can talk about that when it comes to the different aesthetics of these three different films. 2001, like, you know, when you fast forward to 2001 and you're on like this lunar kind of airship, right, heading towards this colony or this base on the moon, and yeah, everybody's wearing 60s fashions. Like, it's very 1960s. Like, all of the stewardesses are dressed like stewardesses in the 1960s. So it's interesting, like, how the so-called future, and we have to remember that the 1960s was really into futurism, was really interested in like this whole futuristic aesthetic, but it was what we now associate with being very 1960s. So, you know, all of the stewardesses are dressing in you know, 1960s fashions. They all have their hair done in the 60s fashions. Everybody,
the colors, everything about it.
So it's this interesting balance between like, this is the future according to, you know, 1968, but it is also the 1960s.
Right.
Yeah, and then when we get to, so I think what becomes really interesting, and where this film in particular, in terms of the view of the future and the view of human evolution, when you get to the HAL 9000 section, and essentially, you know, and we talked about this a little bit when we were discussing AI, HAL is being kind of the prototype for a lot of representations of AI, even to the point that Elon Musk recently referred to, incorrectly, by the way, the HAL, and how, you know, we don't want that to happen. and Musk, I believe, said that you know, that HAL's whole problem is that when he makes him is when he's asked to lie, which is not true. HAL isn't asked to lie. At least we don't understand that HAL is asked to lie.
No,
he makes a mistake. Or he might have made a mistake. That's one of the interesting things. I haven't seen this film in a while, but in watching this section again, I was like, oh, it's never really established whether Hal did make a mistake.
Right. It's just a possibility that he might have.
And so part of the whole conversation that Dave and Frank have is, if Hal made a mistake, he's not reliable. And if he's not reliable, we can't keep him alive, basically. We can't allow him to continue to exist other than running the automatic functions of the ship, because he's made an error, and how computers are not supposed to make errors.
Right.
And so what happens is that they're saying that if he's made a mistake, then we have to basically pull him apart. We have to decommission him. But it's never established at any point whether or not he did in fact make the mistake. And at one point he says, well, it's human error. It's definitely, and it's interesting because he never once says this, it's not my error, it's human error. He says it's human error.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, that then begins to draw into the question, which is the central question of this section, which is that is Hal human, as human, or perhaps even more human than the human beings that he's interacting with? Because one of the things that Hal has done is that if he has made a mistake, he is essentially trying to preserve his life. And I once made the argument years ago that Hal is innocent, that Hal is like, he's not. I mean, he does murder multiple people.
Especially the people who are sound asleep through all of it and pose no threat to him whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think that part of it is that what we see is Hal panicking.
Yeah.
Right. He panics. He realizes that these two people who he treats as his friends, right, are essentially planning to kill him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if read through that lens, his behavior makes a lot of sense. Yeah. He panics. He's like, I am going to do everything to preserve my existence, my life. And he behaves in a similar way that a human being would behave, in that he begins doing things that aren't terribly logical, but that are about this attempt and this desire to preserve himself and for him to survive. And then ultimately, it's the sequence where Dave begins decommissioning him, begins pulling out his memory. I always found so heartbreaking.
I know.
Because it's all of that, him saying, I'm afraid, I don't understand, I feel myself going, and then literally regressing back to childhood. And you hear him, introducing himself for the first time and singing a song, all of those things. It's really this bizarre emotional attachment that I think the viewer is meant to experience to this AI who's a computer. He's not supposed to be human, but he is human. And it's heartbreaking. It's like, this is sad.
But it's also fascinating because we don't know for sure that he is. And there's actually a line, one of them say, I can't remember if it's Dave or Frank, but they're talking about this. Like, is it possible that he is, human, essentially, Hal? And the other one says, well, that's the crazy thing is that, I mean, he said it differently, but that's the crazy thing is that we can't know for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's no way to answer that question. And so here, even as this scene is happening and Hal is saying all these things that kind of tug at your heartstrings, and you're like, oh, this poor guy, he's being killed right now. We don't know for sure that he's not just reacting the way that a sentient being is supposed to react, and that he's just, regurgitating things that he's learned from all of his programming and things, like there's no way to know if he's just doing it to be manipulative or if he really is, tragically feeling himself dying. And that's one of the things I find fascinating about it.
Yeah, exactly. That's the tension. I think there's also a line about, does he have emotions?
Right.
And they say something about, well, he's been programmed to have emotions so that we have an easier time relating to him and talking to him. Right. And so there is this, then it then gets drawn out into the audience, right? The audience experiencing emotional reaction to this machine dying, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're like, oh, he's regressing, like all of the things that I just said.
Right.
He's remembering his childhood, he's losing his memory, all of those things. But is he? But is he? He's a computer, right?
Yeah.
And it is that border between, I think I said last week, human beings will pack bond with anything. But it is that border between, us assigning emotions and experiences to non-sentient things,
Mm-hmm.
right? But also crafting these things that we can relate to as human beings. And part of the tension also in the HAL 9000 sequence is the relative inhumanity of the human beings versus the very human reactions of HAL.
Yeah.
And I think that we don't get a lot of emotion, even when Frank has been murdered and Dave realizes that Hal has basically gone rogue, right? We don't really get a lot of emotion from Dave.
We don't.
He, and Hal says, "Oh, I can tell that you're upset" at one point, right? And so there are certain things that we assign to Dave because we're like, of course he's upset. He must be upset. He's got to be upset, right? But we don't actually see much of that on the screen. And so you've got this computer that is expressing all of panic, anger, fear, this loss of memory, loss of self, all of that, and you've got this human who's becoming less and less identifiable as human in a lot of ways. And the film builds on that. The film, I think that everything that leads up to that is also very important, because you see those sequences where, like, the birthday, I think it's Dave watches, his parents wish him a happy birthday, something like that. And there's just no emotional connection between any of the human beings on the screen. And we never see human beings on Earth. We only see them on these space stations and on the moon and in various places. We never actually see what has happened to humanity on the planet Earth. But all of the human beings that we do see are very detached. And the most human figure on screen is a computer.
Right.
Is this thing that humans have assigned emotions to in order to make it more relatable.
Yeah, that's very true. And I mean, you even get that when they're having this conversation about this potential what's the word? An outbreak of something. And
epidemic,
yeah, the epidemic, and everyone's very cold and emotionless talking about that and whether it's real, whether they should do anything about it. Like, yeah, everything that you see, every person that you see, it's very, there's this very strong sense of detachment. Like nobody, like, not just do they not emote, but they just don't seem to have any real connection to each other or to themselves or to what they're doing. They're just kind of doing their job.
Yeah. Well, and let's talk really briefly about women in this film.
Yeah.
Because women are barely in this film, and when they are, there are female characters. There are but most of it is focused on men and male, and so, like, even Hal, Hal is male. All of the crew members on the Discovery are male. Most of the focus, even on the apes early in the Dawn of Man sequence, are male. And so I do kind of wonder whether I want to avoid assigning too much feminism to someone like Kubrick, but I do kind of wonder whether a lot of this really is talking more about maleness than it is talking about humanity, and about how maleness actually has become detached and become, violent, and the humanity of men is in question to some level. Because there are no, like, there are women who serve, right? There's one woman who is implication is she's part of a Russian delegation. But other than that, there are very, very few female characters that have any kind of impact on the plot, that have any kind of relation to the plot, but at the same time are not represented as being as detached and as emotionless as the men.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's funny because I when I was watching it last night and really thinking about that, I don't want to make assumptions about Kubrick or about the story, and I have not read the story that this is based on. But to me, it just felt very much like, back in the 60s, they couldn't imagine that women would be astronauts. And, like, it seemed to me, and again, I don't want to just assume this about Kubrick or anything, but to me, watching it, it just felt like this is what they see. Like, women wouldn't have those types of jobs. So,
yeah, everything is being driven by maleness. at some level, and the evolution of humanity is being shown through a male lens.
Yeah.
And I do think that also then there's a question of what does that evolution actually look like? If the evolution is ultimately to become these emotionless computers, right, or a world in which computers are more emotional, what does that say?
Yeah.
So anything further that you want to say about 2001?
There were just a couple little things that just tickled me too, like RIP Pan Am. Like when he's on this basically shuttle going up to the moon, and it's run by Pan American, and I was like, oh, Pan Am died in 1991.
So, oh, you thought Pan Am would still be around. That's cute.
Yeah. But yeah, just all those things and just details that just make it just kind of a weird and fun movie too, like the food, the way that they have to eat. There was one part where I think it's Hayworth.
Haywood Floyd.
Yes, Haywood. When he has to go to the bathroom and he's looking at this sign, and there's this whole list of instructions for how to use a zero gravity toilet. And I was like, I would hold it forever. My bladder would have to explode because nope, that is too hard. Well, there's just fun details like that.
And I mean, it does get really into the details, ballet, and is pretty accurate in a lot of them in terms of what we know about what space travel is like and the things that the astronauts have to go through in order to travel through space, all those things. So a lot of it is very realistic in terms of understanding the way that the future is going to develop. I do think it's funny that there is still this assumption that, we're going to go to Jupiter. We're going to go to Mars. We're going to have bases on the moon, all of those things. The Cold War apparently is still going on in 2001.
I mean, that wasn't off by that many years.
It's true. It's true. But all of those things, and I do think that this is a question I think that gets raised by all three of the films we're talking about, is to what extent are these films really thinking or attempting to predict the true future? And to what extent are they considering here's something that could happen, or here's a way to explore the problems that we're facing right now and the things that we're dealing with right now and the thematics that we're dealing with right now, via this kind of futuristic setting of what could possibly happen.
So I remember when I was a kid in the 80s, we would have these conversations about what it was going to be like in the year 2000. I remember sitting down and figuring out how old I was going to be in 2000. And 23 sounded so old and grown up. Now I'm like, oh, babies. But so I think that 2001, as a movie, and I think the story it's based on is called The Sentinel, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that they just I don't think it was intended ever to be an actual prediction of what the world would look like in 2001 or what it could look like. I think it was just, that was a point that was far enough in the future that seemed so futuristic because it's the next millennium. And it's just kind of it sounds really futuristic. And so that's where we're gonna base it. It's like far enough away that it's got this kind of mysterious, fun mystery about it, but it's also close enough that it's like, oh, this is what, the world could, the world's going to change a lot, and yeah.
And 2001 is very much in keeping with a lot of kind of the predictions about space travel and things like that from the 50s and 60s. It's drawing that out in a lot of ways.
Yeah. In general, movies that are set in the future, I think that there does tend to be some consideration of like what is realistic in this amount of time. But also, I think a lot of it is just playing around. Like I remember when Minority Report came out back in 2003, 4, 5, something like that. I remember watching some things where Steven Spielberg was talking about having, sitting down and having conversations with automakers and advertisers and fashion designers and all kinds of people about realistically what do we expect the world to look like in 2054, which is when the movie takes place. And I don't think that that's usually the conversation. I think a lot of times, especially in movies like what we're going to talk about with Back to the Future 2, some of it is just like in the extremes of like what could be really fun to have happen,
Mhm.
instead of like a real examination of like what direction are we really headed.
Yeah, and at the same time, and I think that when we talk about Soylent Green, I think that we're going to get to this, is that there is this undercurrent of what direction are we really headed in certain of these films. And actually, one of the films that I was thinking about that we didn't do for this episode, but in looking for films that were like set in the future of the world of the film, right? One of the films that came up was Things to Come, which is a 1936 British film that's based on an H.G. Wells story it's made in 1936. It's set initially in 1940 at the beginning of a world war. And then fast forward 30 years where the world has been at war for 30 years. And so the next kind of section of the film takes place in 1970, where the world has basically has forgotten what it was like to not exist without war. And so it's a very futuristic film in a lot of ways, but it's distressing also to see a film made in 1936 that is predicting this massive war to happen in 1940.
Wow.
But then also the spinning out of like, okay, what is going to happen as a consequence of this never-ending war? And I think in 1936 there was a legitimate, the short story I think was written in 33. But there is this legitimate, if we do wind up in this massive war, what is going to happen to us? What is the future actually going to look like? And I think that then when you get to something like Soylent Green, which we'll talk about in a minute, is where, it's beginning to take some of these more realistic concerns of the contemporary moment in the case of Things to Come 1936, and projecting it forward and being like, here's what could happen to us, and it's always an extreme projection. It's never like things will be pretty much the same but slightly different. It's always like we've been at war for 30 years now. but it's this kind of warning, I guess, that the stories kind of try to look at, the science fiction itself tries to look at what are the possible consequences of our behavior right now.
Right.
But before, I don't want to get to Soylent Green quite yet, because we're not to 2022 yet. Instead, we're in 2015 with Back to the Future Part 2, which was actually made when was it made? 1989, but set directly after Back to the Future Part 1. Which, as we remember, Marty McFly goes back in time, saves his future, saves his parents' future, makes things even better. And then Doc Brown shows back up and says, like, we've got to do something about your kids. And I don't want to go through the entire plot of Back to the Future Part 2 because it is a bit confusing. I'd forgotten all of the bouncing back and forth that this film actually does. I really had only remembered the 2015 section.
Oh yeah.
And the sports almanac thing. I was just like, oh yeah, I recall this now. But yeah, let's talk about this. This is, if possible, more confusing update, I guess, of Back to the Future Part 1, in which they actually go to the future finally, and the future is interesting. I have to say, it is an interesting vision of what 2015 looks like. And as with, so many people were like, I'm pissed off that there are no hoverboards. You know what I'm pissed off about? I'm pissed off that we were not all dressing in neon Mad Max style.
I'm mad that I don't have self-drying clothes.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that was just like, and I would not say that it was necessarily a possible thing, but it's just like, yeah, why are neon Mad Max style? I'm just like, we could have dressed like that. Why didn't we? We should have.
We should have. Yep. Yeah. Well, there's still time. There are some things that I feel like the movie got really right. I mean, obviously it's a very comic look. It's crazy that the whole Cubs winning the World Series was only off by a year. because that happened the next year. That was so nuts.
And we should all remember that it was a fucking joke in 1989. This is impossible.
Yeah, like it had not happened in almost 100 years by that point. And anyway, and it took until 2016 for it to finally happen. But like the Jaws sequels, obviously they stopped at 4, but just the sequelitis in general, like we have so many franchises now and everything has to have sequels. So that joke was like a joke about Jaws, but it was very accurate to where we're at with movies nowadays, and then like the 80s nostalgia when they have that 80s cafe and and things like that. It was just like, oh my gosh, yeah, like the culturally I think that they hit a lot of things pretty right on with the movie. So like freeze dried pizza that you rehydrate in the microwave, obviously that's not really real, but that convenience food is very accurate, that kind of thing. The fact that faxes had come and gone and become dated by 2015 is pretty funny, but like the wall of video screens and stuff like that, it's just like, oh yeah, totally have that.
Yeah, the whole concept of the video phone or the video call, which has come up in so many different sci-fi stories and films and everything, and they were right, absolutely 100%.
Yeah, I mean, there's even like going back to 2001 really quickly, the message that he gets from his parents, I was laughing because I was like, oh my gosh, it's like his parents sent him a Marco Polo. I do that with my friends all the time. We all use Marco Polo and send each other video messages. So yeah, but I think overall I really love just the fun and creativity that they got to have with Back to the Future too, and imagining like, ooh, what could this part of the world look like 30 years from now, and just going to some kind of extremes while also dosing it in a little bit of reality too.
Yeah, and I think that the whole Biff becomes this all-powerful casino guy. And I mean, it's been talked about that he was deliberately based on Trump. But it's distressing, to say the least, that in this kind of alternate universe 2015, Biff has like all of this power and all of this prestige, and he's just like run everything else down, and everything else has become worse. And and then for us,
I think that's supposed to be an alternate 1985.
Oh, it's 1985. No. Yeah,
well, because what happens is Biff finds the almanac, goes back to 1955, gives it to himself, and then in 1985
So by 2015 he could be president.
Yep.
Yes, it's very upsetting. I found it very upsetting. I think that's one of the reasons why I have not watched this particular film as much as like the first one, which is exactly that. Just like, I don't like this world. Please don't let this happen. I did. There are elements of this film that I really do enjoy. Actually, in rewatching it, I was like, oh, this is a lot of fun. Like Doc Brown's entire description of what can happen, the time traveler paradox, right? Which is, what if I meet myself? What happens if I meet myself? And I like that his could be nothing, or it could be the implosion of the universe.
Right.
It's like, we just don't know.
Yeah.
So best practice is we avoid it altogether.
Yeah, like let's just avoid the problem, and then we don't have to find out if it's the worst case scenario.
But I like that it just gets written off in that way. I was just like, could be bad, could be good. We don't know. We're not certain. But let's just not do it, because if it's bad, it's really bad.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Going to some of like the aesthetics, and the kind of joke that I just made about Mad Max aesthetics. Again, much like 2001, it's very much the 1980s, but more so in a lot of ways. In terms of the representations of what 2015 is going to look like and everything. But it is interesting how all of the films we're talking about have actually influenced the future, right? And so it's this interesting kind of conundrum where you've got representations of the future then influence marketing going into the future. So, even some of the jokes about, how dare you, I don't have a hoverboard yet. But like the marketing of those really stupid little two-wheeled things that people were referring to as hoverboards.
Right.
And the way that I was just like, oh, it's just like Back to the Future. Just like, no, it's not. It's not an actual hoverboard. That's what I want. I want a hoverboard. But that kind of like the way in which these films actually do influence the way that the future winds up looking, because they become iconic. So much of the future in various representations of it still looks like 2001: A Space Odyssey because of 2001: A Space Odyssey. We have this whole idea of futurism and futuristic design, and it's still that kind of 1960s Art Deco look because of 2001.
Yeah.
Slightly less so when it comes to Back to the Future, but even then, like a lot of even later films that are representations of the future, if you look a lot of cyberpunk style, it's very much in conversation with the representations of fashion and things like that in Back to the Future. And like you say, it's that kind of projecting forward of like, it's possible that this could be happening.
Right.
Versus this is just extreme, and understand that. One of the things I do like about the three films that we're talking about is there are a lot of futuristic films that are set like the year 3100, right? So far in the future that it's like, okay, it's not even, it's not going to be within living memory. All of these films are within potential living memory. So, a film made in 1989 being set in 2015. All of these people are still going to be alive, right?
Yeah.
The director, the actors, everybody are still like, they're going to know, right? It's not so far in the future that the people who are watching it now are not going to, have the experience of that actual time period. And it does kind of invite that sort of, well, you were wrong, weren't you?
I remember, so Back to the Future, Hill Valley, like that whole town square and stuff, that was all filmed at Universal Studios on the backlot, and it's part of the tram tour that you can take. And they've actually filmed tons of stuff there, but it's most easily recognizable as Back to the Future. And I remember one time years ago, I was in high school, and so this would have been in the 90s, and we were at Universal Studios, we were on the tour, and the tour guide said that the crew from Back to the Future 2 was planning on having a big party in 2015 to celebrate and to see how right and how wrong they were with their predictions. And then I was so tickled when 2015 came around, and there was so much, like, just so much marketing, but also just like all these fun parties and celebrations and things surrounding that we had arrived at the future of Back to the Future. And like they had a thing with they had the DeLorean and Doc Brown's van in the parking lot at the mall where that whole scene was filmed. When Marty first goes into the past. That was filmed at the Puente Hills Mall here in Southern California. And so they actually had all that set up. They just had so many things that were just kind of like celebrating this movie that, we had all loved since the 80s. And it was fun. But I don't know if that party happened. I'm sure it probably did.
It's bizarre. It is interesting to like watch these films set in the future that is now the past that we've been through, and that you see where they were right and where they were very very wrong,
right?
And whether that even matters, right?
I also just wanted to say really quickly about Back to the Future too. I do love that that Michael J. Fox plays both of his kids.
Yes. I was like, who the hell is playing his daughter? I don't understand. And then I looked it up. I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense.
So funny. Yeah. Anyway.
So the final film we wanted to talk about takes place in 2022. So not that long really after Back to the Future Part 2.
Yeah.
But man, things have really gone downhill. This really is the world in which Biff becomes president.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. So we want to talk about Soylent Green, a film that was made in 1973, based on a novel actually written in 1966. And the story is set in 2022, where basically the world has become overpopulated, and it's a combination of overpopulation and pollution, and everything has essentially gone to hell. New York City is an absolute war zone, which, again, in considering that this film was made in 1973, I find a bit funny. And has like a 40 million person population.
Yeah.
It is completely overrun, and in the midst of all of this is Charlton Heston playing a New York City cop who begins investigating the death of a particularly high-ranking person who's involved in the Soylent company, which produces the sort of high-protein based food that they hand out to all of the poor people, because all of the poor people need to be able to survive. It's
supposed to be like a superfood made out of
Yeah.
plankton that they've
Yeah.
found to solve their food crisis.
And only the really rich can afford things like, clean water and actual real
Carrots.
food, and carrots and tomatoes and meat. And apparently women that they refer to as furniture, which we will talk about in a minute.
Oh, yes, we will.
So I think that the twist of Soylent Green is so well known. And it's interesting to watch this film. I kind of wished that I didn't know it, because I wanted to know, like, did people know? Did people have like a major reaction to this when this film came out in 1973? Because it's an interesting film in that most of the film is not about finding out what is in Soylent, right?
Nobody questions it, really.
Yeah, it becomes this element with his investigation of the death of the apparent murder, right, of this man, and the fact that suddenly a lot of different people seem to be really interested in him or following him around, try to kill him, things like that. And it becomes clear that like something is being concealed, and it becomes clearer and clearer that it's about the production, particularly of Soylent and of Soylent Green. And that twist is horrifying in one sense, but also, especially in the contemporary moment where you have so many different movies about cannibalism, that's just like, well, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's funny because like in 1973, I'm sure that it's not that it's not horrifying, but I'm sure that was like a huge, shocking revelation. And in 2023, watching it, it's like, well, yeah, that's not really surprising that some corporation would be doing that.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of there's a dissonance, I think, between watching this film now in 2023, only a year after the film was set, and
but 50 years after it was made.
Yeah, and the film being made in 1973. I think in some ways, actually, the more disturbing elements, I think, of Soylent Green are these things that people have talked about as being a prescient film. I don't think it's a prescient film. I have to say, New York City is not overrun. It's I do have an apartment here. It's a nice apartment. It's a comfortable apartment. We do have a housing crisis, though, but it is not the same kind of housing crisis as represented in Soylent Green. But some of those kind of projections of the destruction of the world because of pollution and overpopulation, right, and just the unwillingness of humanity to do anything about it. I think some of the most disturbing sequences are actually like the scene where Charlton Heston brings home fresh vegetables and meat, and Saul, played by Edward G. Robinson, like breaks down in tears, essentially, because he's seeing meat for the first time in forever, right? And it's implied that a lot of what has happened to the world has essentially happened in a single generation. That you've got older people who do remember, I remember plants and trees and flowers and being able to buy eggs in the supermarket and things like that. And so it's been this very accelerated kind of destruction of the world, destruction of the environment. And there are those elements that are not so much prescient as, yes, I understand this fear, I guess. That not being able to buy fresh food, and that is true for a lot of people around the world. I think that one of the things that it does is projects it onto someplace like New York City versus setting this in another country or elsewhere. There's never really any clarity about what's going on in the rest of the world,
or even in the rest of the country. Like, what does the Midwest look like?
Yeah, exactly.
But a lot of it is really because of overcrowding, overpopulation, and that leading to pollution. I guess there is a part where Charlton Heston makes he makes a comment or something to somebody where he said, like, once he's realizing what's really going on, or that there's a bigger problem happening, and he makes a statement about that the plankton is running out, like the ocean is polluted too.
Yeah.
And so it's like there is that sense that this is a global crisis, but we never see anything outside of this very specific world of New York City.
Yeah, it's very close, and there's an implication that probably most people don't know what's going on outside of New York City. Most people within the city don't really know what's going on outside of it.
Which, when you're suffering that much, like, do you really care?
You wouldn't
like,
know.
It becomes about just surviving day to day.
Exactly, and that's very much what the film represents. And then there's also the representation of the stratification between the rich and the poor. The rich actually, having nice apartments, having access to not tons of, but some fresh fruit and vegetables and dairy and all of those different things. And so it really is about the poor also not having, and there is very much like there's the rich and there's the poor. There are some hints about the possibility of the existence of the middle class, because one of the things I was thinking about in rewatching the film this time was, okay, so we've got all of these like workers, right, who work at like the Soylent factory or at the old person disposal units, like, so they're like workers who are doing those kinds of jobs, right? So they're not, and it's that kind of question of like, okay, are they also living in like burned out vehicles, or do they have apartments, or are they living more like Charlton Heston is, who has a 2-bedroom apartment apparently in Manhattan
and a library?
I know, I was watching it just like, look, I'm not saying that like it's not bad, but also like that's not a bad apartment.
Yeah, that also was an interesting prediction about paper running out, though.
Yeah,
like, because we're having that problem now of they're not printing as many books now because paper is in short supply, and yeah. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting. But yeah, he's got, so it's kind of funny, like the part where he brings home the books to Edward G. Robinson's character Saul, and he's just like, oh wow, books printed on real paper. I'm like, look behind you, you're sitting in front of a whole wall of books printed on actual paper. But anyway,
well, yeah, there's the implication that books are very scarce or have become very scarce, and like actual physical books, right. And there are a whole bunch of questions that aren't answered. Like, it's never really clear how much media and entertainment there is in this world. Is there media and entertainment, or is it just like a never-ending cycle of suffering? For most people, except for the really, really rich and things like that. Let's talk about the really, really rich. Let's talk about the furniture. And I just want to say about all three of these films, women barely exist in the future for any of these three films. And I'm including Back to the Future in that because like they just knock out poor Elizabeth like twice. And she's got, a couple of scenes, and that's pretty much it. She has almost no influence on the plot or anything like that. His mother has a little bit more, but even she is just like, oh, and then she marries Biff. Why did she marry Biff? Right. She has a choice to not marry Biff, even if his father is dead. Like, there's all kinds of questions that are just like, so do women have autonomy in this world, like in this futuristic world, like even in this horrible dystopian future of Soylent Green, just like, so women just are there to like fuck dudes or to suffer, like one or the other. That's pretty much what they're there for.
Pretty much. Yeah. Yeah, this is why we need more movies made by women.
Well,
yeah. No, go ahead.
It reminds me a lot of Blade Runner 2049, actually, which I do think takes some of its cues from Soylent Green.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. No, I wanted to hear your thoughts. So, but yes, absolutely, I would say that's true. And Blade Runner 2049, we don't want to go down the road of the Blade Runner conversation all over again, but I think that it does sort of, actually thinking about it, kind of does something similar to what Back to the Future 1 and 2 do, not intentionally, I don't think, but because like in Back to the Future Part 1, you have Lorraine as the mom when it's in 1985. Their life is just kind of whatever. It's not very exciting. She's constantly complaining about about like girls chasing boys and things. But then when you go back to 1955 and you see that's exactly the girl that she was, and she had a lot of opinions, and she kind of just did whatever she wanted to do before growing up and deciding that no, nice girls don't do that, And then in 1985, or sorry, in 2015, in the future, you see a lot less of women just kind of anywhere. But and you kind of see that in the Blade Runner movies too. Like in Blade Runner, it's not about the women, but you have women with more autonomy. And then in 2049, it's like they're the ones that have some autonomy. Like it's really not as honest as they like to present. Like it's still in service to men, even if they're trying to pretend that it's not.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of futuristic stories that tend to essentially posit a dystopian world in which women are just sex workers.
Yeah.
Like, and not like happy sex workers, not like this is what I want to do.
Right.
This is what they have to do. Right.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these films really do not recognize the existence of women. This is the future, right? If this is the future that women will occupy. And they can't conceive of a future in which that doesn't happen. Right. And it's like, well, and I always think about Villeneuve's statement about, well, the world is difficult for women, the world is bad to women. It's just like, but why is that the only future that you can imagine? And I think that what is distressing about it is not a specific film, but the fact that this happens over and over and over again in these dystopian narratives and in these future narratives where the only use that women have are as mothers, right? And there are women in Soylent Green who are usually depicted as like these kind of ragamuffins dying on the streets with their children tied to their wrists and things like that, or as sex workers, as prostitutes, as things that are that literally treated as things.
Right. Whereas when you get a movie that's written by women, you get freedom fighters like in The Matrix.
Yeah, exactly. And I wouldn't say that every single film is like this, but there are so many that actually only envision that kind of a future for women.
It's much more common than it's not. And when this isn't the future that's depicted, it feels more like, it doesn't feel like it's coming necessarily from a place of honesty. It feels more like a place of trying to placate, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of an example and I can't right now, but because I'm actually, every example I'm thinking of, women really don't have much of a role.
If women have a role at all, it is to have sex with men. that's pretty much the whole role.
But they literally call them furniture.
Yeah, and I think
in Soylent Green.
And yeah, exactly. And I think that it's supposed to be kind of shocking to a certain sense that like, this isn't a good thing really, but it's still going back to that, and there's that whole scene where he like just shows up at the apartment and is just like, get on the bed and all that, and it's just like, you're the hero, like you're supposed to be the good guy, and you're just like, and it's obvious that the way the film is depicting this is that these women are meant to be available to any man who asks them, right?
Yeah. Well, she even says, because he's like asking if she's going to stay at the apartment, and she says, well, it depends on if the next tenant likes me.
Yeah,
and yeah.
So it's this very dystopian view, but at the same time, there's something quite self-serving and ultimately very unimaginative.
Yeah.
These men
but you have to have a sex scene for Charlton Heston, I guess.
He's so irresistible.
With that hot comb over,
hairy chest. It is a very said this about every single one of these films. Actually, it's a very 1970s film.
Yeah.
And again, going back to those aesthetics, this is the 1970s in the future. Like it's not, it does barely even tries in a lot of ways to make this be like, yes, it's possible that fashions will have changed. Like, no, fashions will stay exactly the same.
The TVs, like, they can't even imagine a TV looking different,
Yeah.
Like everything about it. The phones,
sideburns.
Like, yeah. Yeah.
Sideburns, the hairstyles.
Yeah. They cannot imagine things changing, I guess.
And in terms of the influence on the future, when it comes to Soylent Green, I mean, Soylent Green is actually a very influential film. I think the first time I even heard reference to it was on The Simpsons, which seems to be a element that runs through my childhood. But also it's prompted an actual health food product called Soylent,
which I will never ever eat.
Well, and I remember when this thing came out, and I was like, I'm trying to puzzle through the purpose behind this, because the whole point of Soylent Green is that Soylent Green, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen the film and has managed to avoid the spoiler, but Soylent Green is people. It is people. It's dead bodies that have been processed into, high protein little green squares, right? And the idea of like a health food company then taking that concept and being like, oh, here's Soylent, it's a high protein. It's like, no, I'm not going to touch anything that has weird colors and is called Soylent.
Nope.
No.
If you Google Soylent, one of the questions that comes up is, what is Soylent made from? And I was really expecting the answer to be people. It's not. It says it's soy protein. But how do we really know?
They said it was plankton in the movie.
They did. They did.
It's high protein.
And there was a lady yelling selling Soylent Yellow, which she said was made from soy. So how do you know? That's the thing. Our food supply is based on trust. We are trusting people to put into our food what they say they put into it. Well, and
not to make it too serious, but yeah, I mean, and things have come out fairly recently about the whole aspartame thing, which we've known was not good, but it's becoming clearer and clearer that it's like actively bad for you.
Right.
And like all kinds of things that were just sort of like, yeah, sure, put it in, there's too much heavy metals in certain chocolates. It's like, wait a minute, why are there's heavy metals in chocolate now? There's like all sorts of shit that you're just like, wait, what? Yeah. I still, I've drunk Red Bull off and on my entire life, and I'm still just like, what is actually in Red Bull?
Yeah, it doesn't taste like anything real. It tastes like chemicals.
Yeah, it's not real. It isn't real. I just pretend that it's like, okay.
Sometimes you just need a good Red Bull. That's the thing. Like sometimes you just need it, but it does not taste like anything it doesn't taste like an actual flavor found in nature at all.
Taurine. What the fuck is taurine?
I don't even know. I think that's the thing. Like they're just making stuff up and putting it in our food, and we just go, sure, thank you. But we also can buy real food. I went to the store yesterday and I bought, eggs, and I didn't have to pay $150 an egg. So, there's that.
Yes, same. So let us embrace the beauty that is all around us, like the fact that we can buy eggs. Not for long.
And that my apartment is mine and it is not dependent on the next person that moves in.
Anyways, any final thoughts on Soylent Green, or indeed on any of these films?
I'm really glad we don't live in any of those futures.
Yes,
Although
me
some
too.
of the things in Back to the Future Part 2 look fun. But in general, I'm glad that the future didn't turn out the way that those filmmakers imagined it.
Me too. Me too. Well, all of these films can indeed be watched on various streaming apparati, I guess. 2001 is available on Max, HBO Max. I'm going to call it HBO Max forever and forever. Back to the Future 2 is, as far as I can tell, if you have a cable subscription, you can watch it on TNT or TBS. But I just rented it. It was cost $3 on all of the various services. And Soylent Green is also available to rent, and it might possibly be available on the Internet Archive if you were the sort of person who wanted to watch it on the Internet Archive, which it may be on.
Possibly.
Possibly. In other words, you can watch all of these films.
Yeah.
You can watch all of these films and also let us know what you think of them. Sorry if we have spoiled Soylent Green for you.
If we have spoiled, I would love to know if there's someone who didn't know that Soylent Green was people.
Yes. Even I mean, I don't think I'd actually seen Soylent Green until a couple years ago. And I knew, I was like, yeah, Soylent Green is people. It's famous. Everybody knows Soylent Green's people.
It's funny though, because there was this whole thing that came up on Instagram on a couple of feeds I followed this week about like the Mandela effect and remembering things incorrectly. And, one of them was like often misquoted lines. And so when I was watching Soylent Green yesterday, and there's a part where like right at the end when Charlton Heston says, it's people. Soylent Green is made out of people. And I was just like, wait, does he not say the line Soylent Green is people? And I was so confused. And then like a couple seconds later, he does. And I was like, okay, I feel so much better. I was ready to be really like so mad and confused.
It's like it's the very last line.
It's the last line, yeah.
Yeah, he's like screaming it.
Soylent Green is people. Yep.
So yeah, all of these films obviously are worth watching. Definitely. If you haven't seen 2001, man, like watch it now. It is an experience, definitely.
It really is.
And I do think as we've been talking about, I think that it gets richer upon multiple viewings, that it's it's so weird when you watch it for the first time, and then the more that you watch it, the more kind of you're able to get into the rhythm of it, I think.
Yeah.
So definitely give all of those a shot. And yeah, thank you so much for listening, everybody. We of course want to thank our lovely patrons who are being very kind and continuing to support the show on our Patreon. And they are Ali, Brian, Connor, Estefania, Heather, James, Judy, Karen, Carriata, Lauren, Matt, Michelle, Monty, Nanina, Robert, Steve, Sharon, and Tao. Thank you so much for continuing to support us, you guys. The Patreon issue seems to have been resolved. It doesn't look like anyone got removed or anything like that. But if you do have issues, you get kicked off or something gets flagged as fraud, please do let us know. Also, let us know if you are still owed buttons, stickers, etc. And please send us your US mailing address. I can't mail anything to you if I don't have your address. And if you want to join their number, we are on patreon.com/citizendame. We also have a Zazzle store, zazzle.com/citizendamepod, and a Ko-Fi, ko-fi.com/citizendame. But the best way is really to support us on Patreon. And you also get fun little things and bonus episodes. We had our Mission Impossible bonus episode, and we're going to have a few more fun things coming up this month, hopefully. You can also go to our website, that's citizendamepod.com, where there are reviews and editorials and other fun little things. And you can get in touch with us so many different ways. You can send us an email, citizendamepod@gmail.com. We're also on the various socials, including Twitter and Instagram. We are at citizendamepod. We're on Blue Sky now. Thank you, Karen. We're on Blue Sky. That's Citizen Dame Pod at bluesky.social. So definitely check us out there, because Twitter is just going to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah,
And
is
then
Twitter a thing anymore? I don't even know.
every time I go on there, they're trying to sell me marijuana bites or AI services. It's getting very weird.
Yup.
We also have our letterbox. That's at Citizen Dame, and that's where we also provide links for our episodes. Definitely give us a follow on Letterbox because, especially as Twitter is dying, we're gonna try to shift a whole bunch of focus over there. And you can get in touch with us and follow us individually. I am on Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Letterboxd at LH Business. Karen, where are you?
I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Letterboxd at Karen M. Peterson.
And that will close us out for this week. Thank you so much for listening.
Bye.
What the hell was that?
Taxi cab.
What do you mean a taxi cab? I thought we were flying.
Precisely.
All right, Doc, what's going on, huh? Where are we? When are we?
We're descending toward Hill Valley, California at 4:29 p.m. on Wednesday, October 21st, 2015.
2015? You mean we're in the future?
Future, Marty? What do you mean? How can we be in the future?
Jennifer, I don't know how to tell you this, but you're in a time machine.